leverage, whether Trump has any leverage. North Korea is getting a lot. You said they're basically getting everything from Russia that they could have wanted from China, right? And more. From a Japanese perspective, how does Japan look at that growing tie between DPRK and Russia? I mean, clearly it's not good for Japan, but like, how are they thinking about that? And is their entree to that issue really through DPRK, or is it through Russia?
So short answer is yes, very concerning, but it has kind of many dimensions to it. So clearly Russia giving North Korea a way out of sanction is concern in this context, right? But then what this deepening ties between North Korea and Russia also means for Japan's own national defense is that it could mean more active Russia on the north side of the Japanese archipelago when Japan starts to refocus its defense force posture more towards southwestern island, away from that north, right? So that means potentially Japan basically, have a long archipelago, and they finally start swinging down to southwestern island to meet Chinese maritime challenges. But then what this could mean is that they might have to swing some of that back up to north. And, they have a demographic issue to, fill in all the billets. They have resource issue because of its aging population and economy. That presents a lot of national security challenges for Japan on many different fronts.
Both in terms of what North Korea is concretely getting from Russia in terms of access to technologies, other critical needs like food and oil, but also in terms of, whatever pressure we may have been hoping to have built on North Korea to impose a price for the refusal to denuclearize, to try to use pressure. I know it hasn't changed behavior altogether, but at least to try to use pressure and isolation as means by which to incentivize North Korea coming back to the table by opening up the strategic partnership and cooperating like we've seen over the past several months. Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un have laid a pathway for a protracted period of not needing to talk to the United States. And so that really will impact the president's leverage. What could Donald Trump give Kim Jong-un that he's not getting from Vladimir Putin? I can't think of much.
Yeah. But it's not like the North Koreans haven't been active. They've been very active over the first 100 days of the Trump administration. They have, not in a big sort of flashy way, but quietly and consistently, they have conducted 5 missile tests in the first 100 days. They've stolen about $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency. They've sent an additional 3,000 troops to Russia. And then most recently, they unveiled the largest and most modern missile destroyer, a 5,000-ton warship, the biggest ones that the North Koreans have ever developed. They've been able to test their weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. They've got replenished ammunition stockpiles and billions of dollars of arms sales from Russia, learned military lessons from the war in Ukraine. Clearly a lot that's been going on. So the North Koreans, in their very persistent way, have not been sort of sitting by and waiting for the United States to reach out. They've been quite busy. Is the Trump administration ready to re-engage with North Korea? How would Japan feel about that? And what about South Korean elections a little over a month from now? All this and more next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome to another episode of the Impossible State podcast at CSIS. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy at CSIS and Korea Chair, Professor at Georgetown. Today's topic is North Korea, finally. Most of our podcasts have been about everything else except North Korea. North Korea and the whole question of re-engagement with the Trump administration. And we have 2 wonderful people to discuss this topic with us today. Let me start with my guest to the immediate left, Sid Seiler, who, as many of you know, has, after a very illustrious career in the U.S. government, has joined us at CSIS as a non-resident senior advisor. He was a national intelligence officer for North Korea at the NIC, and really is one of our country's top experts on North Korea. A distinguished career. Sid is one of these few people that have crossed the divide between intelligence work and policy work. Again, for a long time in the intelligence community, but then served in the Obama administration on the National Security Council as director for Korea, and then also as special envoy for six-party talks. What are those things? Six-party talks. They're from a long time ago. But really, really great, Sid, to have you with us today.
Thank you, Victor.
Also joining us is Yuki Tatsumi, no stranger to any of you here in the Washington, D.C. think tank and policy world. Yuki is Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center. She is a CSIS alum. A long time ago, she worked as a research associate here at CSIS and also has worked as a special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan here in Washington, D.C. She's written many works, most recently Balancing Between Nuclear Deterrence and Disarmament, Views from the Next Generation, as well as Lost in Translation, U.S. Defense Innovation and Northeast Asia. So has written across a variety of topics, in particular related to East Asia defense and also, of course, Japan. So folks, we want to talk today. We thought it was about time, given some of the speculation in the press that there might be rumors of efforts by the Trump administration to re-engage with North Korea to try to take on this topic. Let me set the backdrop. You know, President Trump just passed the 100-day mark, gave a speech about it, talked about a lot of accomplishments, but I think it's pretty fair to say that we haven't seen much on North Korea, at least in terms of the policy. But it's not like the North Koreans haven't been active. They've been very active over the first 100 days of the Trump administration. They have, not in a big sort of flashy way, but quietly and consistently, they have conducted 5 missile tests in the first 100 days. They've stolen about $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency. They've sent an additional 3,000 troops to Russia. And then most recently, they unveiled the largest and most modern missile destroyer, a 5,000-ton warship, the biggest ones that the North Koreans have ever developed. They've been able to test their weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. They've got replenished ammunition stockpiles and billions of dollars of arms sales from Russia, learned military lessons from the war in Ukraine. Clearly a lot that's been going on. So the North Koreans, you know, in their very persistent way, have not been sort of sitting by and waiting for the United States to reach out. They've been quite busy. And so I guess the first question to both of you is, should these press reports ring true? We don't know if they are. Is this the right time for them for the administration to start re-engaging with North Korea, given all the other things that are going on? Is this a good time? Is this the right time? So Sid, let me ask you. In terms of it.
Looking back at the past presidents and when they have rolled out Korea policies per se, and when they began to seek to engage North Korea, there really is no right or wrong time from a U.S. perspective. I think president after president has had the flexibility. They inherit to some degree policies and principles, directions, and that allows them to, you know, open dialogue channels, probe, you know, bottom line positions. And so it's not like everything is zeroed out when you have a change of leadership in Washington. The other important thing here is Pyongyang's agencies. Is North Korea prepared to sit down and talk? So I will say, on the one hand, we have no indications to believe North Korea is seriously considering putting anything substantive on the table, let alone sit at the table with us. That said, there are expectations of the United States and of the Trump administration. There are domestic expectations that the president has talked about his relationship with Kim Jong-un. I think people want to see what that translates into. If it's true, there's global implications, certainly the ROK, Japan, and other countries are interested in what we plan to do with North Korea. And then finally, Trump's own expectations. I think he believes at the right time in the right place, he can apply his negotiating skills in a way that can help get at least part of the North Korea issue back on some type of track where we have some interaction with them. We try to develop some influence. We try to address their concerns, and we move the diplomatic ball forward. So I would say now is as good time as any.
So just to follow up, Sid, I mean, you mentioned that you raised the question of whether North Korea has any interest at this particular time. We know, like for Donald Trump, the right time for engagement is always when he has leverage, when he feels he has leverage. And so, I mean, how do you think, I mean, does he have leverage at this point? Like you mentioned North Korean interests, they're doing quite well with Russia right now. So does Donald Trump have leverage at this point to re-engage?
Russia is the variable here, isn't it? Both in terms of what North Korea is concretely getting from Russia in terms of access to technologies, other critical needs like food and oil, but also in terms of whatever pressure we may have been hoping to have built on North Korea to impose a price for the refusal to denuclearize, to try to use pressure. I know it hasn't changed behavior altogether, but at least to try to use pressure and isolation as means by which to incentivize North Korea coming back to the table by opening up the strategic partnership and cooperating like we've seen over the past several months. Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un have laid a pathway for a protracted period of not needing to talk to the United States. And so that really will impact the president's leverage. What could Donald Trump give Kim Jong-un that he's not getting from Vladimir Putin? I can't think of much.
Yeah. Let me ask you, so one of the things that Japan has done a lot in terms of North Korea policy on the leverage side has been participating in the multilateral sanctions regime.
Right.
So if you could tell us like what you think the state of that sanctions regime is at this point, again, given this question about leverage, right? Trump is always about leverage. And also how the Ishiba government looks at this particular issue. I don't know if they've said anything about this issue. I know that we've seen since Abe a slight change in the position to really allow for an open door, if you will.
Right.
Any thoughts on the Japan side?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. So I think picking up on your second question first on the what Ishiba might or might not have said in the past. He really hasn't said much since his time in the office. He's very focused in his first, 6 months or whatever in the office by getting his relationship with Trump administration right. And they're in the thick of tariff negotiations right now. So I don't think this particular leadership has much of a bandwidth to pay attention to anything else. That said, though, Ishiba did say in his policy speech, I believe, in the Diet at the beginning of his administration, he did make a reference to the fact that all these abductees' families are getting very, very elderly, and they have already begun, many of them have begun to getting either very sick or, passed away. So he did express a desire to seek some kind of a resolution to this for the sake of those aging families. But beyond that, I really haven't heard much specific, let alone, him making any specific comments about sanctions that Japan has been participated in. But, picking up your point, I think because, it always has been China always has been the first country to give the way out to North Korea away from out of the sanction tight spot. But after, its relationship with Beijing starts going a little bit of a south, but then now North Korea has Russia, which is a great backup. It's like a better backup than it has ever hoped for. So it really doesn't I think sanction regime, although it's still in place, doesn't have nearly as much bite as it might have been in the past. And that also de-incentivized North Korea, frankly, to come to the table, in my mind.
What about, can you say more about, so the abductions issue has been such an important issue. It's been sort of the way Japan's policy towards North Korea has been steered, right, for the past. Is that really still the case very much? What's the domestic political context of this issue for Japan if if Trump were to re-engage with Kim Jong-un, where would Japan be on that? Would they be ready to move forward as well, or do you think they would pull back? Or
I think that abductee issue is a very interesting one. It now has a place in a different context. Now, Japan's issues with the northern territories vis-a-vis Russia used to be in this category too, that it is a very historical issue. And then obviously it's one of the World War II legacy issues with Russia on this territory issues. But then with North Korea, it's in a very different context, but still from the legacy of the Cold War era. And but they both have a similar place in a Japanese foreign policy in a way that no Japanese leader can say anything about those issues not important for Japan. It's just politically not palatable to any Japanese leader. And then I think in a sense that really has put Japan in a box for the last, few decades since this, our trial of diplomatic effort to denuclearize North Korea has ever begun. So I think if let's say, for hypothetically speaking, if President Trump announced on his Truth Social that I am meeting Kim Jong-un, right? First thing Japanese would try to make sure is that his talking points will include his reference to abduction.
Sid, go ahead.
If you look back at the history of this issue, and you and I have been in the middle of, six-party talks and other multilateral fora, and of course, together with our bilateral discussions with Seoul and Tokyo on this, there has never been a time when the abductee issue has proven to be an obstacle or a hindrance to our pursuit of denuclearization. It's somewhat like the human rights issue in that, and inter-Korean issues, that one can only imagine a truly developing close relationship between the U.S. and the DPRK that has some degree of resolution of the denuclearization issue, or confidence we're on a positive path. And a North Korea that's made that strategic decision is likely to be responsive to our calls for them to talk to Korea more sincerely and to address Japan's legitimate concerns about their the abductees. But again, I think people have mischaracterized Japan as unilaterally pursuing this niche issue at the expense of denuclearization objectives, and that's just not been the history of the talks that I've been involved in.
I agree with that. I think Japan always has found a way by working with the United States to place the abduction issues always in the mix, but doing so in a way that it does not block any types of denuclearization effort, because they do realize that is a much more clear and present and urgent issue that they need to address for their national security concerns.
Yeah. So I entirely agree with you. I think that's where the policy is today. I would beg to differ on one specific point, which is there was a time when we were doing the six-party talks where the first Abe government, the first Abe administration, would not participate in the heavy fuel oil equivalent distributions in the initial rounds because the North Koreans were so obstinate about not talking anything about abductions as issues. So that did happen at one point, and so we had to do a workaround, at least for the first cycle of providing these incentives to North Korea, where we would go, the U.S., Korea, skip Japan, then do China, Russia, and then come back. But I agree with you. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen is that the U.S. has talked to Japan about looking at the abductee issue as part of this broader basket of human rights issues between the U.S. and Japan and North Korea. As part of a broader human rights issue, that's a precondition for normalized relations, and that I think that has been an evolution in the policy as well. But of course, like this issue matters a great deal for Japanese public, Japanese people. I met Megumi's mother, spent a whole afternoon with her when Megumi's parents came to the White House and met with President Bush. So it's really it really is quite important. Let me shift to a slightly different time, and I'd love to get both of your thoughts on this. So one of the things that we've noticed about the way President Trump has talked about the North Korea every time he's gotten the question has been, he's basically been positive, left the door open to re-engaging, but he's used language that's a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. And in particular, it's something along the lines of, oh yeah, my good friend Kim Jong-un, he's got nuclear weapons, or he's a nuclear power. The term nuclear power seems to come up. It came up in Rubio's confirmation testimony. President Trump has said it a number of times. And for those of us who watch this very carefully, that sounds like significant language. It could be just Trump speaking loosely, or is it really significant language that connotes possibly, potentially, de facto acceptance of North Korea as a country that possesses nuclear weapons. So Sid, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, whether you think that's significant and whether it matters. And then Yuki, also your thoughts on that, and in particular, if there was any coverage in Japan about how they looked at that sort of language and what it would mean to the Japanese foreign ministry if they continue to hear this sort of language.
Well, we know, first of all, it's not a technical term per se, like a nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it does look like it has been used often enough that it reflects some type of thinking among the leadership, among the president, Secretary Rubio, that somehow their diplomatic approach could either be justified by the urgency of needing to deal with a nuclear power, or that Kim Jong-un could be somehow enticed to come to the negotiating table if he feels he'll get some type of respect, the respect that he was seeking to get in Singapore, the respect that he was seeking to get at Hanoi, that he basically scored an own goal, or he fumbled away the opportunities. And so to provide Kim Jong-un with the thought that, that we would treat him with respect, that we would not, treat him as a defeated state, which is what North Korea always like to call U.S. calls for denuclearization, and somehow it was asking them to strip naked or come to the table as a defeated state. So I think it may be more within that context. I would say that through the secretary and the spokesperson over its state, spokesperson at NSC, others have clarified that denuclearization of North Korea remains a goal of the United States. And I think that in its significance is greater than these more casual references. Maybe casual is the wrong word, but less nuanced than we otherwise might think references to North Korea as a nuclear power.
Yeah. Yuki, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree to that, because when President first used the word nuclear power, I can already like, without even talking to anybody, I can already imagine, right? My friends in the Japanese foreign ministry thinking, oh my gosh, here it comes. There are people in this administration who are more talking about nuclear, like arms control, as opposed to denuclearization, because that is, I think, the most important goal that Japan cannot forsake, is the denuclearization of North Korea for all the legitimately, understandably, strategically important reasons for the stability of East Asia as a whole. But I think with this particular president, I would still categorize a current way that he's using this term as more of a loose reference to the fact that acknowledging that North Korea does have a nuclear program, but it doesn't mean that we are already in the land of where we kind of accepted in India and Pakistan as a de facto nuclear power way back when, about 30 years ago. I don't think we were there. And then I think that is where Japan tries to avoid of getting there.
Let me take the conversation on the same topic to the other side of the peninsula, which is the discussions in South Korea, increasing discussions in South Korea about nuclearization. The fact that we've been so spectacularly unsuccessful in denuclearizing North Korea through diplomacy, the lack of attention to it right now, at least by the Trump administration, the failures of the Biden administration, the failed agreements, whether it was Leap Day, right, that you were involved. Well, you were also in six-party talks. Leap Day, six-party talks, agreed framework, just everything has failed. And plus a lot of uncertainty with regard to President Trump and where he's going to go in terms of commitments, whether it's to NATO or to others. You know, there's a lot more talk in Korea about this idea of South Korean nuclearization. So, Sid, I want to ask you how you read that, and then Yuki, I wanted to ask you, like, what's the Japanese reaction to this growing chorus of opinion on the topic?
Well, as you know, it's somewhat amazing that we haven't had this conversation more deeply, more intensely earlier. Although clearly, since the early days of this issue, in the early 1990s, you know, the implications of a nuclear North Korea and a non-nuclear South Korea has been on the minds of security experts in the Republic of Korea and elsewhere for many years. And what was a major motivator not to challenge that was, one, to bring credibility to denuclearization talks, in particular based upon the 1992 North-South Korea denuclearization declaration, to remain committed to that even as North Korea was not, to go into six-party talks and negotiate a path towards denuclearization, even agreeing to the language of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as a way, as suggesting somehow there was anything for South Korea to denuclearize or not. So we're at a point in the evolution of this issue where the conversation, in my opinion, needs to be had. Even if the result is clearly this is not going to meet South Korea's deterrence needs, right now, thanks to good work in the last administration, we addressed some of these extended deterrence concerns. We had the Washington Declaration, stood up the NCG, started to discuss how to meet the North Korea threat. In the months and years in the immediate future, I think there are going to be examinations of arms control formulae or some other approach to North Korea that maybe addresses some issues of concern to the United States, but brings into question the credibility of the U.S. Extended deterrence to South Korea. So we need to continue to have these discussions, whether it's about a nuclear South Korea, whether it's about the reintroduction of non-strategic nuclear weapons to the peninsula, whether it's about dual-use aircraft and other options. I think it's a natural topic for discussion.
Mm-hmm. And we see it coming up quite a bit now in the opinion polling and other sorts of things. What is the Japan reaction? I find that when I go to Japan, what is interesting to me is when I meet with Japanese security experts, it used to be that the first thing they would ask would be about North Korea, denuclearization diplomacy. Is the U.S. going to engage? Now the first question is not about North Korea; it's about South Korea. And do you think South Korea is going to go nuclear? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that recent trend of a discussion or direction that South Korea's domestic discussion on this issue is going definitely is been noticed by Japan, being very closely watched. There are two clear there are differences amongst how they receive it between South Korean discussion about reintroducing American tactical nukes into South Korea versus South Korea's own indigenous nuclear program. Mm-hmm. The latter, I would not say it still wouldn't cross the threshold for Japan to start actually taking steps for indigenous, but that South Korea's, let's say, announcement of we're going to pursue our own indigenous nuclear program, that will definitely reactivate very intensely some of the internal conversation that Japan has had in the past about re-examining what their nuclear option might be. And that definitely then, in that case, that'll involve whether their traditional approach, which they continue to maintain up to today, of maintaining what's known as nuclear non-3Ps, do not possess, do not produce, and do not introduce, would those exactly three same principles still hold to meet Japanese need for its deterrent needs. And there are always a question about maybe Japanese government should formally say only 2 Ps apply, and we're dropping third P, which is not to introduce. and make it even more, kind of open the aperture toward a little bit more toward, up to this point, introduction of U.S. nuclear weapons or nuclear subs are up for, technically speaking, consultation, a prior consultation between the two allies. But if they get rid of this third P, that drops. So that kind of opens the door of U.S. strategic forces comes in and out of Japan without even making any note, making any announcement or any consultation. So would that be come into consideration? If South Korea's indigenous nuclear program will probably put that in very much of an active play.
The I guess like one of the things that I don't know but I noticed sort of at the end of the Biden administration in their efforts to try to engage with North Korea, they said basically we're ready to talk any place, anytime. And if they got the question about are you willing to talk arms control or threat reduction, which is a code word for saying, you're accepting them as a nuclear weapon state, the response was always something along the lines of we're happy to have discussions on anything that sustains and bolsters stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. So it was like a slight change in wording that sort of left the door open to we're ready to talk about anything. But I think you're right. In a Trump administration, Trump may talk loosely, but then the people below him always try to hammer the policy back into its place, saying, no, it's still denuclearization that will still be the case. But it still raises concerns, right? I mean, like it raises concerns and interest in Japan.
It still definitely raises huge concerns in Japan. It's like, are there still people thinking about arms control, threat reduction realm and containing nuclear program as opposed to denuclearize?
Yeah.
You know what I find amazing? The problems that one would have with arms control are usually not the ones that come to mind when there's this knee-jerk reaction against it. The concern is that somehow it would lock in North Korea's nuclear weapons status. I can imagine an arms control that retains CVID as an end goal. So you have your cake and eat it too. We know it's all about denuclearization, but we're getting there along a timeline that's reasonable and doesn't seek to get everything at once. Well, frankly, that's how we negotiated the six-party talks at September 19th joint statement and the follow-on implementation actions, the approach that subsequently followed with the Obama administration, and even Trump term one, it was we're not going to get it all, but we need to be on a path with CVID as the end goal. My concern about the arms control approach is that North Korea has made it pretty clear what that will look like to them. And that will be looking at parity with the United States as a nuclear adversary, starting with United States rolling back its military exercises, rolling back its extended deterrence, strategic asset demonstrations, putting U.S. forces on the table, and putting the very U.S. security commitment to the ROK on the table, because all of these consist of what North Korea describes as the nuclear threat that they face. And only when these things are addressed, the exercises, extended deterrence, U.S. forces, Korea, U.S. ROK security treaty, then and only then can North Korea consider denuclearizing. And what that means is we would have to really reduce the nuclear deterrent that we provide South Korea in order for the hope that maybe North Korea might accept certain limitations on certain weapons. And it's just not appealing when you think about what the negotiating objectives of North Korea would be under arms control talks.
Right. So, I mean, if we think about this on the ground, the easy way to square the circle is to, if they were to meet again, just to get them to reaffirm the Singapore statement, which had denuclearization in it, and then start to engage and, effectively threaten to like freeze the facilities, get inspectors back in, get a nuclear test ban, all these things. But your point is that those intermediate steps, we're very familiar with them. We've done them before. But this quickly becomes not a very feasible prospect when we think about what the North Koreans will demand, right?
Because you were personally involved, we were both personally involved in that period of the six-party talks in that 2006, 2007, 2008 time period. And look at how much the North Korean nuclear threat has changed. There's no way they're going back to the table and putting anything of significance on that would attract us without high demands of us that I think we would just find unacceptable.
Find unacceptable. Yeah. Can I ask you, Yuki, the other piece of this, obviously, we talked about leverage, whether Trump has any leverage. North Korea is getting a lot. You said they're basically getting everything from Russia that they could have wanted from China, right? And more. From a Japanese perspective, how does Japan look at that growing tie between DPRK and Russia? I mean, clearly it's not good for Japan, but like, how are they thinking about that? And is their entree to that issue really through DPRK, or is it through Russia?
So short answer is yes, very concerning, but it has kind of a many dimensions to it. So clearly Russia giving North Korea a way out of sanction is concern in this context, right? But then what this deepening ties between North Korea and Russia also means for Japan's own national defense is that it could mean more active Russia on the north side of the Japanese archipelago when Japan starts to refocus its defense force posture more towards southwestern island, away from that north, right? So that means potentially Japan basically, have a long archipelago, and they finally start swinging down to southwestern island to meet Chinese maritime challenges. But then what this could mean is that they might have to swing some of that back up to north. And, they have a demographic issue to, fill in all the billets. They have resource issue because of its aging population and economy. That presents a lot of national security challenges for Japan on many different fronts.
Interesting. I mean, I know that Japan is very concerned about this so-called opportunistic aggression scenario with something happening in Taiwan and then something happening in North Korea, or vice versa.
Right.
But, but you're raising this other issue, which is even putting aside the two contingency scenario, that as they focus more on the Southwest islands for a Taiwan contingency, there's a lot of things that Russia can do in the North. Yeah. And does the military relationship now between DPRK and Russia, does that help Russia in the North? I mean, a lot of its troops and munitions, but I guess it's missiles too, right? So.
Yeah, I think to them it does. It does kind of mutually helping is probably the best word that I could use. But throw China in the mix too. Because we were already, Japan was already worried about China and Russia doing more coordinated actions precisely on that side of the archipelago these days, right? And then it didn't go unnoticed when Japan was, pulling all the forces in to respond to that, triple disaster 10 years ago. China and Russia keeps doing this incursion into the into their airspace. Then they have not forgotten that. So, basically multiply that intensity times 10 in this current environment. Very worrisome for them.
Last question I want to ask you, Sid, is so there's an election in South Korea, June 3rd. There will be a new president of South Korea. How would that election affect a Trump engagement scenario, or how would a new Korean government respond to a Trump re-engagement scenario with North Korea?
That's a great question. And I know that, one of the principles that we had in place during the Obama years was that, we would place a high priority on the alliance above all else, so that we didn't chase Pyongyang down roads that appeared to have some type of glimmer of hope in a way that passed Seoul, that Korea passing, that they're concerned about, and would cause rough feelings in the relationship and angst and what have you. So there was a commitment that I think carried over into the Trump administration, Trump term 1 and Moon Jae-in, coordinated quite closely on their approaches. And I think they were able to calibrate their respective approaches to North Korea in a way that was complementary. And I think that would be true regardless of who is new. Obviously, the difference between the conservatives and the progressives in terms of how they may seek to approach North Korea will be significant. I don't know that North Korea would act much differently toward a progressive government than it would towards a conservative. Just they have shown no interest in talking to the United States. They've demonstrated recently, they said so directly that they were fooled by Moon and deceived by Yoon, and frankly, they've given up hope for talking with South Korea. So I'm positive that we can navigate these waters regardless of the outcome of the election. I think for the progressives, they must learn that this is not simply a turning back the clock to 2018 and 2019. The difficulties in the relationship with North Korea are not the result of the hardline Yoon administration policy toward the North. They're the result of Pyongyang's choices, behaviors, and actions. And the same, by the way, I think holds true for China and Russia as well. So I think, I hope that regardless of the outcome of the election, we will have a partner who is willing to engage with the Trump administration in addressing these key security concerns in Asia.
Right. And then just to finish, could I ask you
Yeah.
that, so, the last major engagement between Japan and the PRK was the so-called Pyongyang Declaration that was Koizumi and Kim Jong-il. Is that still if there were re-engagement, is that still the go-to document for a Japanese government if they were to re-engage with North Korea?
I would say yes, that'll be the base of which they would engage and they would re-engage. And that's where all the essence that they would need to seek from North Korea, which is denuclearization, abduction issue, and this comprehension package idea. That's all the essence of that is there. So I think I would say they would start by referring back to Pyongyang Declaration.
Great. Okay. Well, great discussion. We shall see. We'll probably have to come back again and do this in a few more weeks to see as the situation develops. So thank you again to our guests. Thank you, viewers, for watching our podcast, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of The Impossible State. Trump tariffs, and what do they mean for Korea and Japan? Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Impossible State podcast at CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm your host, president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, Korea chair at CSIS, and professor at Georgetown University. And today, we're talking about Trump tariffs and how they affect Japan and Korea. But before we begin our discussion, I just wanted to take a minute to remember the passing of a very dear friend of mine personally and of CSIS, and that is former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. He was a longtime friend of CSIS, a board member of CSIS. I worked with him in government when he was Deputy Secretary of State, and his passing is a big loss for all of us in the U.S. foreign policy community and for folks who work on the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. I'll just say that many people knew Rich as a Japan person. And in fact, the famous Armitage-Nye reports that were done on the U.S.-Japan alliance were something that were very closely tied with CSIS. We helped to facilitate a lot of those reports, but all the work and the sort of the brain power behind them belonged to people like Rich Armitage, as well as Professor Nye. But what people don't know is that he was also very much an advocate for the U.S.-Korea alliance as well. That is not as well known about him. And just to give you one example of that, you can all look up in the Washington Post archives an op-ed that Rich Armitage wrote with myself and with our current colleague, Mike Green, in which I think the title of it was "Obama Should Go to Korea." because he had a trip to plan to Asia, and Korea was not on the itinerary, and it was actually Rich Armitage's idea to write something together on that. And in fact, he did go to Korea on that trip as a result of that. So we miss you all very much, Rich, and our condolences to the family. Okay, so today's discussion is about Trump tariffs and what they mean for Korea and Japan. Unless you've been hiding under a rock somewhere, you would know that this is sort of the story of the day. And we have two wonderful people to discuss this issue with today. Christy Gavella, Dr. Christy Gavella, I'm proud to say, is our new Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at CSIS. She is also Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford in England, my alma mater. She was previously the inaugural director of the congressionally funded Center for Indo-Pacific Studies at the University of Hawaii. She was also a professor there. She was deputy director for Asia at the German Marshall Fund, and has a long history working on both Japan and Indo-Pacific issues. Also joining us is Bill Reinsch, who, if any of you who follow our podcasts, his voice is ubiquitous these days. They're on the Trade Guys, our other podcast talking about everything that's going on with Trump and tariffs. He is Senior Advisor and Scholl Chair Emeritus with the Economics Program and Scholl Chair in International Business. Previously, he was Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration during the Clinton administration, and also does some teaching of his own at the University of Maryland. So thanks to both of you very much for joining us for today's podcast about Trump tariffs. And I think, Bill, I'd like to start out with you. I know that you've been sort of in the thick of it, since Liberation Day and certainly before. I guess the first question for those of us who look at this from a non-expert perspective is we see, all of these massive tariffs being levied against the world, both partners, allies, as well as competitors. We see a lot of, I guess the polite word is variability in what we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration. Like, how much of this is part of a real new landscape of tariff walls, and how much of it is just illusion or negotiation? And also, what is the latest? Like, I don't know what is the latest yet. It changes every hour. So.
Well, it does. Are you feeling liberated, Victor? Is that, yes. The real question, you've asked the real question, is what's the point? What is this trying to accomplish? There have been, from Trump himself and from his various assistants, basically 4 different reasons given for this, and some of them conflict with each other, which makes it very difficult to figure out exactly what's going to happen. One is the rebalancing theory, that we have been treated badly by everybody, friends and allies and adversaries alike, for many years. They're stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. And basically, we need to get even. We need to rebalance and get them to pay back all the things that we've been paying them for all this time. And that involves tariffs. Trump historically has one narrative, the U.S. is a victim, one metric, the bilateral trade deficit, and one tool, tariffs. And all of that is appearing this time around. So that's one goal. Another goal is, which contradicts that, is this is all a negotiating tool. Let's raise tariffs, and that will force other countries to come in here and basically make concessions to us, and in return, we won't raise our tariffs. And that's a really good deal if you can engineer that, because it means they give up something that we care about, and we give up nothing. All we do is agree not to do what we've said we're going to do. So that's the second goal. The third goal, which doesn't fit either of the first two, is revenue. They need the money because they're trying to extend the tax cuts that expire at the end of this year. And there's a search on for revenue because under our rules, the tax cuts have to be balanced with spending cuts or revenue increases somewhere else. And this would not, our current estimate in the economics department, based on the latest set of revisions, is that they'll bring in around $220 billion a year. That's not nearly enough to offset the tax cuts, but it's not peanuts either. Of course, if you think about it, if you're bringing in revenue, then you want the tariffs to remain. And so if you're trying to negotiate the tariffs away, which is the other objective, then the consequence of that is no revenue. So these are kind of irreconcilable goals. The fourth one is he wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And I think this is core in his thinking. He really believes that we have lost our manufacturing base over the years. When I wrote a column on this, I borrowed from the Ronnie Milsap song, Lost in the 50s Tonight. And there he is. Actually, there is Joe Biden, too. They're both in the 50s because they want to bring back classic heavy manufacturing, steel, cars, machinery. That's what they focus on. And they want to bring it back. And they believe that tariffs are a way to do that. Biden wanted to bring it back, too. He was a carrot guy. Let's bribe them to come back. Let's offer incentives. Trump is a stick guy. Let's punish them or threaten them and say, if you don't come back, you'll pay tariffs. And he said many times, you know, if you make it here, there's no tariff. So the question is, which is the real goal and what's going to happen? And these things have changed so many times, it's very difficult to predict. They've been on, off, up, down, postponed. First, there were going to be no exceptions, and now there may be some exceptions. And every afternoon he signs new executive orders and talks to the press, and he muses about these things. The latest was now he's thinking about giving the auto companies a break without being too clear about exactly what that break is. Friday night they exempted semiconductors and a boatload of downstream electronic products, computers, phones, laptops, computers, other electronic things that contain chips. And then announced on Sunday that that wasn't really an exemption, that was a temporary postponement because they'll be captured later on by other tariffs. So it's a moving target. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And the result of that has been really monumental uncertainty, because if you don't know what's going to happen, I mean, you can't even project 3 months. You know, the tariffs that he imposed on April 2nd have all been postponed, except for the 10% flat rate. Will they come back in 3 months? Will they continue to be 10%? Will they come back at different levels than what was originally headlined? If you have a supply chain, if you're an American manufacturer and have a supply chain that involves foreign parts and components, which is most of them, it's really impossible to make a decision about what you're supposed to do. And so right now, I think most companies are, after they got past the panic mode, are waiting for the dust to settle to try to figure out what the appropriate next step is.
Interesting. So every component, every product has a foreign manufacturing component, except our radio here, because this is from the 1950s, and it's all American. We just want everybody.
It's also not plugged in, Victor. I see that.
Yeah. We don't want to say anything about operating, right? But I mean, so a couple of things. The first is I just want to draw folks' attention to, I think you did a report where you talked about on this fourth objective that even if Trump were successful in bringing this manufacturing back to the United States, we don't have the labor force to support it. Right?
We don't have the labor force, and there's also a timing issue. On the labor force, yes, we did a paper that came out last November that looked at, well, you know, we stayed away from the high-tech PhD engineer issue, and we just focused on 4 basic parts of the economy: construction, transportation, agriculture, and healthcare. And what we found were 6-digit job shortages in all of those sectors. We don't have enough construction workers. We don't have enough truck drivers. We don't have enough people picking fruits and vegetables. We don't have enough people picking lettuce. We don't have enough nurse practitioners. We don't have enough healthcare workers in general. And the demographics actually are approaching, they're not approaching, but they're heading in the same direction as Japan and Korea. Our birth rate is below the replacement rate. We've avoided shrinkage for decades based on immigration. We are now pursuing an immigration policy which is going to deport all those people, which leaves the question of, if you're going to create all these jobs, where are the workers? You know, and particularly in the United States, where are the workers that want to pick lettuce or want to engage in manufacturing jobs? Where are the workers that want to make steel? We had a high school group here visiting last week, and I asked them that question. You know, how many of you envision your future as on the assembly line? And the answer was nobody. I assume they all want to be TikTok influencers, but which is probably not a realistic objective either. But you know, they're not looking for the kind of jobs that Trump wants to create. The other problem is timing. The tariffs go into effect now, or in a week, or next month, or in 3 months. It varies and changes. But the short answer is soon. If you're going to build a factory or even reopen one, you can't do that between now and June.
Sure.
It just doesn't work. The classic example is Stellantis, which used to be Chrysler in the United States, which makes Jeep, among other things, announced last year they were going to reopen a factory in Illinois. So it's already there. They're going to retool, reopen. Their start date is 2027. So 3 years simply to reopen and retool something that is already there. If you're talking about building new, you have to talk about zoning, you have to talk about local, state, federal regulations, you have to talk about environmental impact statements, you have to talk about all these things to slow things down. And Trump sort of says, well, you know, we're going to get rid of all those. He can speak for that at the federal level up to a point, but a lot of this is local, you know. And immediately, if you want to build a big plant, particularly one that has a lot of emissions, then the neighbors come in, and the neighbors say, this is not a good idea. So we have a time problem here where people are paying the tariffs soon, and the action that Trump wants them to take to mitigate that is years down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, so very interesting. Let's shift over to Asia, and Christy, ask you, so, you know, how are allies responding? How are both Japan and Korea have already had interaction with the Trump administration on this? Maybe you could sort of give us your views on how Japan in particular is responding, and also maybe say a little bit about how you see their response compared to all these other countries that have been tariffed and how they are responding.
So in the case of Japan, I think you see kind of three major categories of response. The first has really been to the domestic audiences in Japan. So Ishiba has really framed this as a national crisis and is calling for unity amongst the parties to deal with it. And so you've seen things like very practical measures to open up something like 1,000 consultative centers around Japan to help small businesses figure out what to do about these tariffs. They've been taking steps to make state-backed loans more accessible to businesses. And the various parties have been coming forward with proposals to try to cushion the impacts on consumers. So they've been talking about things like perhaps lowering the consumption tax or coming up with some kind of stimulus funds. So that has been a big part, is just how this is going to affect Japan and what they're going to do in response to this, which is a big part of the political story for the Japanese government. The second part has really been dealing with the U.S. directly, of course, and Ishiba has been in contact with Trump. He has appointed a negotiator to interact with Besant, and his appointee is a fellow who is in charge of economic revitalization. His name is Akazawa, and he's a close ally of Ishiba. And the idea here is that Japan is going to try and get a good deal for itself, is going to try and make a case that Japan has done a lot for the economy of the U.S. and that it has a lot to contribute. And so that is something that we'll hear more about later this week. And then the third major thing, I think, has been Japan reaching out to other countries to basically make common cause for trying to preserve the trade order and trying to find a way to protect the relatively open, free flow of goods that they feel is very important to the Japanese economy. So you see Japan really moving forward on all of those fronts. I think that in comparison to some other countries, what's notable is you don't hear Japan talking about retaliation. In some statements made by Japanese politicians or officials, they've said that it's not necessarily off the table, but it really isn't something that Japan is considering seriously. And this is, of course, in large part due to the fact that Japan is a major U.S. ally and is very reliant on the U.S. for its security. So retaliation does not really seem to be an option for Japan in terms of its overall foreign policy portfolio, and it's not something that they're willing to risk risk for either the economic or the security consequences. You see this, of course, is very different in the case of China, which has retaliated, or in the case of Europe as well. I think they're more willing to discuss retaliation, although they have not necessarily pulled the trigger on that, partly because they feel like they have more latitude, or perhaps they are already losing more in their relative security negotiations with the U.S. So it's a very distinctive response from Japan, I think.
So I'll just say on the that's all very interesting, and I want to ask you also about apparently there will be elections at some point this summer and what impact that has. But let me just say on the Korea side, we're seeing a very similar sort of reaction on the part of Korea. First, there was for 4.5 months no reaction because the government was basically stymied by an impeachment crisis. But literally, like a couple of days or even a day after the decision was made to impeach the South Korean president, the acting president was able to get a call with President Trump and talk about trying to find a pathway forward, put some people on an airplane. They're here in D.C. now trying to negotiate some sort of deal. So very similar reactions by Japan and South Korea, which are more about, all right, let's figure out a way to work with this versus what we see from what the EU is talking about and what China has certainly done in terms of response. But of course, South Korea has elections in June. I would imagine whoever takes that job would love for this problem to be behind them when they start office. Unlikely that's going to be the case. But Japan also has elections most likely this summer. And so what is the potential impact there? Or even if Ishiba may not make it through, right? He may not make it through this summer, so. Yeah.
At this point, I think that the foreign policy uncertainty is playing a role in Japanese domestic politics, but it seems like Ishiba may be the one to have to sort of deal with this problem up until the election. I think it's difficult to say, just because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen, how it will all play out. But it's certainly true that the risks of coming forward as a potential Japanese political leader right now are certainly high, and there's a lot of downside. So I think that we'll tend to see Ishiba try to muddle through this situation until the July upper house elections. But then there'll be some discussion about whether a new leader might come to the forefront to try to perhaps make a case for a new vision of leadership. But I think right now, a lot of Japanese people are looking at the different opposition parties and wondering, is it really the time to take a risk on a different kind of leader, or would it be better to stay the course given all of the uncertainties around Trump, around trade, and also around security? So I think that those factors tend to suggest more stability and perhaps a little bit more leaning towards the LDP, despite all of the domestic dissatisfaction with them due to domestic scandals and such.
Do you think, and I'd like both of you to weigh in on this question, do you think, like, if you're the leadership in Japan or Korea right now, like, all you're basically trying to do is sort of, get some, in the near term, get some sort of deal done, and just kind of, like you said, like, people aren't going to make huge decisions about moving manufacturing and everything because things are so uncertain right now. They're just kind of trying to muddle through for as long as they can. Maybe like the goalpost right now is like the midterm elections, like just make it through to the midterms in the United States and then see where the policy goes. I mean, or are they really seeing this as the new reality and like we have to cut a deal with Trump to get rid of what was Japan's 25% or 24%, whatever it might be, or is it really just everybody's just kind of trying to cope and delay? Oh.
Well, it's really damage limitation at this point. Nobody's going to come out of this unscathed. I mean, companies have realized that, if your supply chain manager is any good right now, you've already got best price, best quality, and best delivery, which are the traditional values. So what you're going to be forced to do, if you're forced to alter your supply chains to make them more American, no matter who you are or where you are, you're going to come up with something that is more expensive and less efficient. So it's damage limitation. I think for countries, it's sort of, hope for the best but prepare for the worst. There's a lot of talk about is this the end of the trading system as we know it and the end of globalization? And I'm in the group that thinks that's not the case. Partly because the tools that enable economic integration haven't gone away. Enormous reductions in the cost of transportation and communication, the digitization of the economy, that's all still here. The connections are still here, so they'll continue to be used. And what we are beginning to see, and Christy just mentioned it, is other countries beginning to talk to each other about relationships that bypass the United States. What gives me a modicum of hope is that a lot of that discussion is very traditional. It says, let's talk about free trade agreements. Let's talk about in a traditional approach, the old way we used to do it, without the United States. So Europe is talking more. They're trying to make sure that Mercosur gets done. They're talking more to the Mexicans. The Canadians are trying to make more of the existing Canada-EU deal. There's discussions amongst Southeast Asian nations. So there's a lot of ferment going on, which has not produced anything yet. It's too soon. But it's, let's develop workarounds because, the United States may be this way for at least 4 years and maybe longer.
On that, Christy, there were reports that China, Japan, and Korea sort of restarted, after like a 4 or 5 year hiatus, restarted talks on a trilateral free trade agreement. Like, I don't know how far those things are going to go, but like it goes to your point earlier about sort of making common cause with others, so what else is Japan doing in that respect?
Well, I mean, just to echo what Bill was saying, I think that Japan is really trying to look for other countries that believe that there is something worth preserving in all of these trade agreements. And this parallels what we saw back when the U.S. withdrew from TPP. I mean, one of the things that Japan did, besides working with others to help shepherd that into the CPTPP, was to sign a trade agreement deal with the EU, which it had been talking about for a long time, with the UK. So I think by reaching out to other partners like Japan and China, Japan sees this as an opportunity to help shore up the trading system through other deals. And this shouldn't really be read as an alternative to the U.S., but more as they see it as supporting the world trade system. Right now, we're not making any progress in the WTO, et cetera. So these kinds of things are the way that countries can basically solidify and institutionalize trade practices and rules.
Yeah, I have to say on the Japan, Korea, China thing, I'm a skeptic. I mean, you're right. They've been talking about this for years. Without much progress, and I mean it's complicated because they're neighbors and there's enormous amount of history amongst all three of them. But in economic terms, the Chinese economy is, it's this 800-pound gorilla next door, but it's also the system they use is really incompatible with the Japanese and Korean economics. And it's very hard for me to see a deal being struck, but you may know more about that than I do.
I don't know more about it, but it's not going to stop me from making a point, which is, you remember back when we did Chorus and we talked about TPP. Everybody used to look down on sort of RCEP because they said that this wasn't sort of a high quality free trade agreement. It was just superficially about lowering tariffs on certain products in certain areas. It wasn't like deeply penetrating labor and environment and all these other things, like a RCEP type agreement that just focused on lowering tariffs in certain areas. That's like not such a bad thing today, right? That doesn't sound like such a bad thing given where we are today. The bar's certainly gotten lower, and so I don't know if something even. I agree with you that like the media played this up as the country striking back. That wasn't what it was. There is. As you said, there's an opportunity to reach out, find common cause with others to try to preserve the trading order. It's ironic that China is now seen as a partner in that, in some sense. But even like that sort of, I agree, it's hard to reach an agreement of that nature, but given where we are today, like a simple, good old-fashioned free trade agreement that just lowered tariff barriers, not non-tariff barriers, not labor, not environment, that, relatively speaking, wouldn't be a bad thing these days. But
no, it would be a shot in the arm for the trading system, and for the WTO.
Right. So where is the WTO these days in all of this?
Well, MIA for the most part. Yeah. Although I wouldn't say that's because of Trump. The United States continues to participate. It's been very hard for them to reach multilateral agreements, And I have to say, frankly, that the biggest problem there has not been the United States, it's not been China, it's been India, which objects to almost everything. And not only objects to multilateral agreements, but has objected to the incorporation of agreements that they haven't participated in into WTO rules. I mean, what the WTO has done in the face of the opposition from India and South Africa and one or two others, Nicaragua and Venezuela also come to mind, has been to go to what they call joint statement initiatives, which are essentially plurilateral agreements, coalitions of the willing. You know, if you want to make more progress on e-commerce, let's get together and see what we can do. And there have been a few of those. There was the Information Technology Agreement, and there just was one on investment facilitation, which is not rules about what you have to let in, but rules about how to make investment easier, that quite 120 odd countries signed and participated in, not the United States, incidentally, and not India. But they agreed to it. You know, it was finished, and 120 countries is not peanuts. And so then the moment came, can we take that text and put it into the WTO rules, like the Government Procurement Agreement, like the Information Technology Agreement? And India objected, because their position is that negotiation should only be multilateral with everybody. And of course, they block those too. So I think they're MIA for other reasons, and I'm pessimistic. You know, I mean, I'd like to think that we'll get to a better place, and perhaps if they can revitalize the dispute settlement system, which has also fallen into disrepair, and that one the United States did have something to do with. If they can bring that back, that may help restore things. But what has happened that's interesting is developing countries have started to tell the Indians, you know, you're really not speaking for us. You're blocking things that matter to us. There was a famous, actually, blow-up in the last ministerial between the Indians and the Thai ambassador, who said to the Indians, you're hurting our farmers. You know, your rice policies are hurting our farmers. This is, you know, you're not helping developing countries. The Indians were so upset they demanded the recall of the Thai ambassador over that. But it's a sign that I think other countries have realized that that the Indians are not always speaking for everybody, you know, everybody in the South's interest. But it's still, short-term prospects are not bright.
Okay. Let me just shift to one other topic, which is what is the, so Japan and Korea have a lot of foreign direct investment in the United States. In the past 4 years in particular, we've seen dramatic increases in, you know, a lot of states in the South, and as well in the West. Christy, how do you think, I guess the question is, how does not just the tariffs, but the overall Trump administration's, I like to say that they're strategically, they are quite predictable, because there are things that Trump has believed in for a long time, like this question of merchandise trade deficits, but they're tactically quite unpredictable, right? And so how, from the Japan perspective, how do they look at that unpredictability when it comes to thinking about investment, and in particular new investments? Ishiba came here, it was in January, he talked about $1 trillion of investment in the United States. But that was, of course, before we saw this rollout of this tariff policy. So just curious about your thoughts on that, and also, Bill, in general, your thoughts on both these super high tariffs and also the unpredictability as it affects investment decisions by foreign countries in the United States.
So clearly there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but many Japanese companies, as you said, have already invested very strongly in the U.S. And so if you look at some surveys of business sentiment, we see that, you know, many of them are planning to keep those investments and perhaps to increase them. And, you know, if that gets them around tariffs, that will be seen as positive. Many, unfortunately, had also invested in Mexico as a way of, investing in the U.S. Through NAFTA, et cetera. And so that they considered to be a very reliable strategy and has not proved to be so. So I think that, looking at these kinds of kind of shifting rules is worrying. So in the short term, I think companies are trying to leverage the assets they have in the U.S. and perhaps, find ways to increase. But I think in the medium to long term, they're wondering about how reliable this is. Can they find other markets? It is very difficult to do so, though. So I think they're kind of trapped. But there is a sense that, they don't really know what to expect from the U.S. And if there were promises made for example, incentives under the Biden administration, those were not necessarily to be relied upon under the next administration. So I think, it's a difficult business environment. But in general, I think that companies are trying to maintain or leverage things in the short term to try to get around these tariffs.
But my sense is that it is a difficult business environment, but at the same time, it seems like the government is being given some political space, right? I mean, the public is not, they're not up in arms like, let's retaliate, right? There are upper house elections, but as you said, is there really somebody who wants to step into this at this particular point? So there's more political space, even though it's a very complicated business environment.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at polls of the Japanese public, actually, most Japanese people believe that they will be affected by Trump's tariffs, but actually a very small percentage actually favor retaliation. So I think that the Japanese government in that sense does have room. I mean, I think people were disappointed with Ishiba because there was this sense that maybe he should have been able to get an exemption preemptively. I think personally, I think that's an unreasonable expectation for him. But I think that the Japanese public is aware that it's a difficult situation. They do want to see results. They do want to have their economic welfare protected. But there is space for the government to find a solution within that.
Yeah, and Bill, on this question of tariffs and foreign direct investment, your thoughts on that, but also what Christy raises. During the first Trump administration, there was basically a playbook that all the world leaders used, which was to come in, to meet with Trump, to flatter him, to provide a big package of goodies, and then they could pretty much get out damage-free. But, that certainly doesn't seem to be working just yet. So your thoughts on tariffs and investment, and then your thoughts on the playbook. So.
On investment, I think, I agree with Christy. The best talking points the Japanese and the Koreans have is the substantial amount of investment they've already made. Japan is number one, Korea is up there, and I'm sure what will be on the table when they come in to have a discussion is how much more can you invest, and then we'll see what they have to say. But they have a very good record on that, and I think that's something that they should draw on. Companies are going to wait and see what happens, and companies have to calculate, like I said, plan for the worst. But what is the worst? Is it 4 years? Trump can't run again, maybe. But even if he can't, he'll make sure that the next candidate from his party shares his views, and it may be Vance or it may be somebody else. We'll see. But so this could go on longer. I think it's going to be a lengthy period of uncertainty. The thing to keep in mind is that, the only people that have retaliated so far really are China and Canada on autos. And the EU pretty clearly is going to, but has been, every time Trump postpones, they postpone too. So most countries are not retaliating. And I think I wouldn't put out to pasture the Trump 1.0 strategy that you described. It still works with some refinements. And I think if you want to see how it was done so far anyway, masterfully, it was with the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. And she followed a three-part strategy. Part one was assert your sovereignty politely, don't poke him in the eye. You need to do that for domestic political purposes. Two, make small concessions, preferably ones you've made before, and hope that nobody remembers. And three, the important one is let him win. Because my observation has been, more often than not, the act of winning is more important than the substance of what he wins. What he really wants is the press conference, the White House Oval Office appearance where he's saying, I win, they surrendered, we're great. And the question of what exactly did you win kind of gets pushed to the side. We saw this with China in the first term, where he went in with big demands, in fact, the same demands that previous presidents had made, and ended up with them agreeing to buy a bunch of stuff, which they then didn't do anyway. And one of the press conference questions was, well, what about all these things you wanted? And the answer was, well, that's in phase 2, which never happened. I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're going to be, if countries understand that it's not just flattery, it's letting him win. Right. Because for him, these things are zero sum. You know, he doesn't win unless somebody has to lose in order for him to win, which is not the way most trade agreements work. Most trade agreements are win-win. How do you figure out how we both get something? I think the Scheinbaum strategy has worked well, and I think you're going to see more countries doing that. And if you think about it from Trump's point of view, maybe it doesn't matter if they give everything. You know, if they give something, I really do win, because I'm not giving up anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that reminds me of, I think it was on one of your other, on the Trade Guys podcast, which you should all also listen to on CSIS. Either you or Scott made the point that Trump is not wired for trade negotiations, because he's wired as a real estate guy where there are winners and losers, and trade is a win-win game, right? It's a positive-sum game, not a zero-sum game. So that's an interesting observation on which to conclude. Certainly a lot more to talk about. I hope to have you guys both back on again in the future. Thank you all for watching another episode of The Impossible State, and we'll see you again soon. U.S., Japan, Korea trilateralism, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's trip to Asia, and more. Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome to another episode of the Impossible State podcast. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy at CSIS and Korea Chair, as well as Professor at Georgetown University. Today we're going to be talking about U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral relations, and it's a bit of a homecoming here at CSIS because our guest is none other than Dr. Michael Green. As many of you know, Mike Green is currently Professor and Chief Executive Officer at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He's also a non-resident senior advisor and Kissinger Chair here at CSIS. Prior to that, he was Senior Vice President and Japan Chair at CSIS, as well as Director of Asian Studies and Professor at Georgetown. Again, as many of you know, he served on the National Security Council staff as President George W. Bush's senior-most advisor on Asia. And his most recent book is Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Shinzo Abe, published by Columbia University Press in 2022. Mike, it's great to have you back at CSIS and on The Impossible State.
Yeah. Love the studio. Yeah. It's a big upgrade.
Yeah. You look like you've got some sun there. You got some of that down
under
in
Sydney,
sun.
It's impossible not to.
Yeah. That's great. Anyway, it's great to have you back, and great to have you on The Impossible State. I guess we could start by perhaps we could talk a little bit before we get to trilateral relations. As Secretary Hegseth just completed his first trip to the region. He was in Japan, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam. Any thoughts? Anything stand out to you about the trip from your perspective in Sydney?
Well, the news in Washington is all about Signalgate, the use of signal to discuss highly sensitive war plans, which dogged him throughout his trip, or about Liberation Day and tariffs and disruption and all the rest. But in reality, you know, the Hegseth trip to Asia was a little piece of normality. I mean, in most of his joint statements, most of his initiatives, you know, they could have been the Biden administration. or the Bush administration, reaffirming U.S. commitments to allies, pledging some pretty serious money for defense cooperation in the Northern Marianas, moving forward with the Joint Command upgrades in Japan, probably very reassuring for allies, actually. And it shows you that amidst all the disruption and chaos on trade and on development and in politics generally, there is a certain amount of continuity on U.S. defense policy in Asia.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that there were at least some rumors here in D.C. about the whole question of the Joint Force Headquarters in Japan and whether the Trump administration might not follow through on that. He made pretty clear during the trip that that was not the case and that the U.S. was going to follow through on that.
Yeah, and that's something the Japanese wanted. And it's something that costs money and it changes power structures within the military. So it had some opponents. And I think the rumors it was going to be defunded by DOGE probably came from parts of the U.S. military that didn't like it. But in the end, it is strongly supported on the Hill. And it makes sense to have the U.S. command in Japan upgraded from 3 stars to 4 stars and turned into, what's called a Joint Task Force Capable Command, like USFK, CFC in Korea, or like NATO, because Japan is no longer in the rear area. Our whole command structure was premised on the idea Japan would be rear area support for Korea or Taiwan. It's the front line. It's actually inside the front line. The Chinese are operating on the other side of Japan. So you need that ability like we have in Korea to fight tonight. Yeah. So it's logical, and it was reassuring.
And then also in the Philippines, he reaffirmed sort of the oversight and access agreements to the 9 ECTA sites. So overall, it seemed like a pretty good trip. I mean, like you said, a piece of normalcy in an otherwise pretty chaotic Washington.
I think there's a straight line allies can draw from the Quad foreign ministers meeting Marco Rubio held very early to the Ishiba Trump summit. The joint statement was very robust on Taiwan, commitments to Japan on the Senkakus, to this trip by Hegseth. The treatment of President Zelensky of Ukraine in the Oval Office, the sort of eerie affinity for Vladimir Putin, the really unnecessarily ideological attacks on Europe and NATO, all that stuff is unnerving leaders in Asia. I was just in Taiwan and Japan, and of course I live in Australia, so it was unnerving for them. But I think the Hegseth trip should be some point of reassurance because on Asia policy, as you know, there's a lot of bipartisan support. It doesn't tell us necessarily what Donald Trump thinks. That's the wild card still. But in terms of the U.S. government, the Congress, this is an Asia First administration. It's not an isolationist administration on the whole. It's not good for Europe, but it's an Asia First administration. You can see the prioritization in his trip.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, since this is a podcast about Korea, I guess many of our listeners and viewers would note that one aspect that was noteworthy about the trip was the skipping of Korea on this trip, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that also.
Well, there is a long history of administrations wondering why, or new presidents wondering why we have so many troops on the Korean Peninsula that are only, at least ostensibly only for the defense of Korea against North Korea. So Jimmy Carter, of course, almost pulled troops out of Korea. You'll remember in the Bush administration, it didn't get too far, but Secretary Rumsfeld was skeptical of the U.S. military presence in Korea, pulled a brigade out during Iraq. Had to, because we needed the brigade, but there was a larger, I think, purpose there of drawing down in Korea. And this is going to be a challenge because I think that, despite the fact there is a military pivot to the Indo-Pacific, focus on competing with China, Indo-PACOM over NATO, and all of those things, Korea's not necessarily going to benefit from that. It's really more about maritime Quad countries. And Korea, I think, is going to look like an outlier, like a continental power, like Europe, like NATO. And it's a challenge because if we see army brigades cut to plus up on if we see army brigades cut to plus up on air and naval capabilities, and the Army's short army brigades, the one in Korea is going to look sort of, isolated and not so useful. And so there's, I think, going to be a lot of pressure on the alliance with Korea to to get in the competition with China, which is uncomfortable for Korea in many ways, to free up the U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula, maybe to pull them out. And it's unfortunate Korea is going through political turmoil because this is, you don't want this done sort of unilaterally by the U.S. with Korea reacting and all those bad strategic signals that result. You want this to be a joint U.S.-Korea modernization of the alliance. But as you and I have discussed, Seoul's not in a position to do that right now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, even though we're past the court decision at this point, still there's a period of at least 2 months, if not longer, where we'll see some difficult leadership in Korea. I mean, I think the most immediate reason, of course, was that we didn't have a government in Korea. It made, as you know well, these official trips to Asia cover a long distance. They're trying to pack a lot in a short period of time. Making a stop in Korea when your counterpart will probably not be in office in a couple of months didn't make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, I think we are at a point where there's going to have to be serious consultations with Korea about, what the mission of U.S. force posture on the peninsula will be, because it probably won't be the same as it's been for the last 50, 60 years.
I think it's likely to change. I mean, you could imagine a scenario where Secretary of Defense Austin or Harris's Secretary of Defense chose not to go to Korea for all those reasons, but they would find other ways to signal commitment, and we're not seeing that. So I think within the Pentagon and within the Trump administration, there are ideas brewing about Korea, and hopefully we'll have a government in Seoul that can get ahead of that and package this in ways that show the strength of the alliance and Korea's role in Asia and don't diminish deterrence with North Korea. But I could imagine a scenario where it's kind of chaotic and more reminiscent of the Carter administration's withdrawal plans.
Yeah. I mean, it really does require, as we know both well, half of government is making lemonade out of the lemon. And so, they really need to start thinking about that in a very serious way. Let's move to the topic of the day, which is trilateralism and the future of U.S. ROK Japan trilateral relations. Let me start, Mike, by asking you, so we had Kurt Campbell and Mira Rapp-Hooper at the very end of the Biden administration come to CSIS and do sort of a retrospective. And we asked Kurt, what was sort of the high point of his 4 years? And it didn't take him long to answer. He actually didn't even blink an eye, and he said it was Camp David, the trilateral relationship. Maybe you could sort of explain to our viewers, what did you think when you saw that meeting take place and the things that happened after, and how important is trilateralism from your perspective as someone who's studied the region for a long time?
It's very important. You've written a book on this that traces the history throughout the Cold War of Korea-Japan relations under two symbiotic but separate bilateral alliances with the U.S. It became more important in the 90s to deal with North Korea and to deal with uncertainty about China. I think the high water mark until Camp David would have been the 1998 Kim Dae-jung Obuchi Summit, which was, I think, probably the biggest reconciliation between Japan and Korea ever. And as you'll recall, we were just young whippersnappers, but in 98, because of the Japan-Korea reconciliation, there was an opening to do more stuff trilaterally. So I'm sure you remember this, but when Secretary of Defense Bill Perry became the special envoy, he had an expert roundtable on what he should do. And it was a lot of the high and mighty, and then a couple young PhD, you, me, and I think Scott Snyder. And I remember you said the most important, you may not be able to take care of North Korea, but the most important thing you can do as a special envoy is knit together the U.S., Japan, and Korea. And a lot of senior Asia hands gave you a hard time. I backed you up, but we were pretty young, because it ran against how the U.S. thought about alliances, which was mostly bilateral. But it was important. And around that same time, I was working as an advisor for the Pentagon, and Kurt Campbell was the lead for Asia in the Pentagon. And we had put together for 1998 the first official trilateral defense talks in Seoul. And I worked on that in the Pentagon. And as we were flying there, Kurt asked me, all right, we're having this trilateral meeting. For the next one, what's something really out of the box, really pushing the envelope we could do? And I said, well, some kind of tabletop exercise, some kind of war game, so that our Japanese and Korean allies can see how much they need each other. But that's a big, I don't know, Kurt, that's a big move. Better make sure everybody's on board. And so we go to this defense trilateral. It goes pretty well. And at the end, Kurt is wrapping up. And he says, I just want to let you know that for the next meeting in Washington, Dr. Green has designed a trilateral tabletop exercise. I hadn't done anything. And there was this Marine two-star general who said, oh, are you using the National War College X-49 framework for that? And he completely was making up. I said, yes, I am. And so we did the trilateral game, and it really showed, it was when we were revising defense guidelines with Japan to open the way to more cooperation on Korea, Taiwan regional contingencies. And Korea and the U.S. were really finalizing the instability planning. And so in this tabletop exercise, each side could see they needed the other. The Koreans could see the Japanese weren't ready. It was really important. And then to end the story, I was in Korea and saw Pak Young-ok, who was the assistant minister in charge of this on the Korean side. And he said that the Chinese came knocking to complain about this trilateralism. And the Korean Defense Ministry said the U.S.-Japan alliance is critical for Korea's national security, which was really good. But then, of course, that era ended, and we had ups and downs, and really instability in the trilateral relationship for years and years. Highs and lows. Camp David was significant. There were no defense trilateral exercises and almost no talks. And within a year of the August 2023 Camp David summit with Kishida, Yoon, and Biden, if I'm remembering correctly, there's something like 19 or 20 military exercises, significant ones, mostly trilateral, some with Australia and others, and something like 50 senior level meetings on cyber and defense. I mean, it's
65 or something.
65? Yeah, I was counting to September 2024, but it just opened the door. And trilateral security cooperation, as you know well, it increases deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea. It makes sure that we're ready for contingencies and can respond to them. And it signals strategically to China that there's a cost for them supporting North Korea. China doesn't want NATO's, but if they support North Korea and threaten Japan and Korea, they're going to get more and more things that look like NATO. So it has a strategic signaling effect, deterrence effect, readiness effect. With the politics in Seoul, people are not sure how much of this will continue. Yeah. But I think it will for the most part, but we'll see. Yeah.
I mean, I think it will too. I mean, I think that's right. A couple of thoughts is I feel like so when this was coming together in the late 1990s, it was largely driven by a North Korea contingency. Yeah. Right. And these days now the trilateral is much broader in scope. As you said, it's in cyber, it's in supply chains, it's in freedom of navigation, it's in Taiwan, Taiwan's defense. It's sort of much broader now. To me, like one of the most significant things to come out of that meeting was this commitment to consult, the sort of, in quotation marks, commitment to consult, which was about the closest you could get to some sort of collective security declaration among the three parties, right? That they would commit to consult on almost every sort of issue.
Language very evocative of NATO Article 4 and 5 and U.S.-Japan Alliance Article 5. Yeah, not ratified by treaty, but pretty evocative of a security commitment.
Maybe I mean, on the Korean side, I think that the external environment has changed such that, the Korean government has to sort of continue to support this, whether they like it or not. But I guess the question really is the Trump administration. And so how do you think the Trump administration looks at this trilateral? I can't recall if Hegseth made reference to it during his trip to Japan or his speech at APCSS. I don't really remember. But how do you think the Trump administration is looking at trilateralism?
I think for Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command, and for U.S. versus Korea, it's essential. And so the uniform military is all in. I think the career State Department officials who know Asia are all in. Wasn't always that case. I mean, even in the Bush administration, there were certain senior State Department officials who shall not be named who gave you a very hard time about pushing for trilateral coordination in the six-party talks. And then another Obama-era State Department official in a think tank event accused you and me of having a trilateral fetish. So there were views in the U.S., less in the Pentagon, more in the State Department, that trilateralism was too much trouble, that it was too provocative to China, that it was an obstacle to getting diplomatic progress with North Korea. I don't hear any of that. I think there's unity within state and defense and the NSC on how important trilateralism is for all the reasons we've discussed. President Trump last time was asked in a press conference about this, and he said, "Why should I do it? I got too much on my plate. What do I care?" He is not someone who thinks about strategy in those terms. Every relationship, friend or foe, is about leverage, and that's not the frame of mind you want in someone who's going to lead on trilateralism. So if I were in the NSC, I would not be recommending trilateral summits, because I don't think President Trump's heart isn't in it, and God knows what would happen. But I think Marco Rubio I know he is a big advocate of this, and Hegseth should be. If they don't do it at senior levels of the Pentagon, it would be a worrying sign, though, because it could be that they don't want to hold out. They don't view Korea as part of the team that's taking on China, there is that view in the administration in some quarters that we need to narrow down to those allies and partners who are going to really be there with us. And, it's a pretty small group when you do that. It's Japan, Australia, the Philippines. And, it's, to me, completely self-defeating to say, we don't need Europe for Korean Peninsula or Taiwan contingencies. Europe may not send troops or frigates, but the economic costs they can pose are massive. And it's equally foolish to think that in a competition with China, we don't care about Korea. Korea, may or may not have a military role in a Taiwan contingency. I think U.S. forces have enough flexibility now, and the Koreans understand that they could. But Korea has technology, munitions, defense production. 1% of shipbuilding is in the U.S. Korea, among the democracies, is the biggest shipbuilder. There's so much we need Korea for to be able to compete strategically. Semiconductors, Hanwha and POSCO and steel and munitions, and the Pentagon knows it. And the Navy knows it, the Air Force knows it. So it would be very self-defeating to say, well, just because the Korean government isn't doing exactly what Japan's doing or Australia's doing, who needs them? To me, it's almost an ideological way of thinking, and it's honestly, as scholars, what I see is structural realism. I see John Mearsheimer's hand. I think it's a structural realist view of things where you don't have room for gray. And that's very, very self-defeating if we're going to compete with China. Why would you reduce assets on your side by insisting on purity?
I think, it's interesting. On the one hand, there are all these areas that have been opened up for cooperation under Trump administration with Korea. Like you said, shipbuilding, energy is another one, right? There's a big one, energy, and also supply chains, clearly. But it's interesting. I testified at the Senate last week on our alliances in the Indo-Pacific with our friend Randy Shriver and Oriana Mastro. And when we were preparing for the hearing, it really struck me that our discussions on sort of access, spacing, and overflight with Japan, with the Philippines, even with Australia, is on the one hand very developed, and with Korea, it's almost non-existent, right? Because it's only one contingency. And that is such an imbalance that really has a danger of pushing Korea to the margins. And when you compound that with the absence of a government for the last 18 weeks, right, at such a critical time of a new administration coming in here in D.C. that's running at 100 miles an hour, it's like a very bad combination.
So I think the argument almost sells itself why you need Korea. We need allies. It's the shipbuilding, it's the technology, it's the broader strategic impact of having a joint and combined command. We go together. That unity is powerful. the argument builds itself, but you need the right people making it. So I think what it requires is, I think Indo-Pacific Command and U.S. Forces Korea and U.S. military completely gets it. That's good. I think Congress gets it. Your testimony, I'm sure you were invited to testify because people on both sides of the aisle wanted you to make this point. So Congress gets it. Career officials and security experts get it. Japan gets it. And I think maybe as a way to pivot back to trilateralism, Japan's role politically in Washington in sustaining support for Korea is really important. As you know, the Carter withdrawal was abandoned in large part because of Japanese pressure. And
Prime Minister Miki. Prime Minister Miki came in. Yeah,
and the Donald Trump flirtation, remember in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, he said he'd like to pull forces off the Korea someday. When Prime Minister Abe met with Trump, every meeting he pressed him on the importance of the Korean Peninsula, even though his relations with, the Korean government weren't always so good. As with Moon Jae-in, they weren't good at all. But strategically for Japan, it was too important. So you need the uniformed military, you need the experts, you need the Congress, you need Japan, and then the ingredient you need is a government in Seoul that's working with all these different groups and sending the right signals. That Korea is, the polls in Korea. Alliance support is about 90%, and anti-China sentiment is almost 90%. So. But the signals out of Seoul have to be about the Indo-Pacific, about Japan and solidarity with not just Japan, but Australia, about being an active player in the Pacific Islands and development in Southeast Asia and countering nefarious foreign influence in Sri Lanka. And Korea brings tools to all of that. But you get the wrong people in Seoul, and if their priority is using China's leverage to get a deal with North Korea, and they're not sending those signals, it's going to reinforce the worst instincts in Washington. So I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I'm optimistic that the argument can be very compelling, but you need the right people making it. And the missing piece right now is what's going to be the message coming out of Seoul.
Right, and individuals do matter. Mearsheimer, our good friend John Mearsheimer in structural realism, okay, but at the same time, individuals matter, like the Korean president, Trump himself, Putin, Kim Jong-un. These people are driving politics right now, so they matter a great deal. Can I step back and ask you more broadly in terms of thinking about the future of the architecture of the Indo-Pacific? The big innovation that we saw during the past 4 years of Biden was this real networking of the hub and spokes relationship, AUKUS, right? Camp David, U.S., Japan, Philippines, all these different groupings. When you sort of look forward, how do you think and then at the same time we have, the decade plus of China-based institution building in the region against the backdrop of ASEAN building, ASEAN sort of based regional architectures. When you put all these together, what do you think the future looks like? Remember a few years ago, people thought the future might be EAS, right? The East Asia Summit. What do you think when you look at the future of this architecture? Where do you think it's headed?
So our friend Hal Brands at SAIS is editing a book on strategic competition, and I'm writing the chapter on allies and partners. And he said, you got to keep it to 6,000 words. So I had 6,000 words, but in the chapter, I chronicled everything that is beginning to happen with the Quad, with the U.S.-Japan Trilateral Australia, with the U.S.-Japan-Korea Trilateral Australia, defense production and sales expanding, Hanwha in Korea, Japan's Mogami-class destroyer Hanwha in Australia, Japan's Mogami-class destroyer, strong competitor for the Royal Australian Navy's next major shipbuilding program. All of these connections, and it was like 3,000 pages, 3,000 words in footnotes. So I realized, that's too much. I got to find a way to summarize it. There's just so much going on. And Beijing criticizes this as the creation of little NATOs. And in a way, they're right. There's not a collective security agreement. They're all bilateral. And each of those bilateral treaties is a bit different. So it's not a Senate-ratified collective security commitment across all these defense and security partnerships with India and Japan and Australia and so forth. It's more what John Hamre calls federated. so that defense production, exercises, intelligence sharing look more and more like a collective security arrangement. And that, to me, is not going to stop. Even if we have a trade war, even if we have, a Trump-Kim Jong-un summit, and the main reason it's not going to stop is because the PLA is not going to stop. And the past really 6 months, the PLA has entered a new chapter in its exercises, its military posture in Asia. And that new chapter is something I knew existed, a lot of people knew existed, but now the whole region can see it, which is any fight over Taiwan or Second Thomas in the Philippines or Senkakus or in the Yellow Sea, any fight with a U.S. ally or partner by the PLA is now seen as by the PLA as a fight with everyone in Asia. So at the same time they're doing these strangulation exercises, massive military exercises all around Taiwan to simulate blockade or invasion, they're doing missile tests in the Yellow Sea. They're doing missile tests into the Pacific Ocean, Dongfang 21 long-range missile tests capable of hitting Guam or Australia. They're sending heavily armed destroyers and surface ships through the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand, forcing commercial airlines to divert and then circumnavigating Australia. And there's more. And so they're telegraphing to the region and testing and rehearsing themselves for a theater-wide campaign. There is no, when I was in the Pentagon and we had the Taiwan crisis, it was a Taiwan Straits crisis because we owned the seas. Mm-hmm. Not anymore. China's strategy is to go at any access point the U.S. has, through Australia, from Guam, and Korea. Korea is, Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Those Yellow Sea exercises were meant to prepare for and signal to Korea, we can take you on too. So that is going to link these alliances even more because the militaries, when I travel to Taipei or Seoul or Tokyo, the militaries and the intelligence services and the governments can see this. They are now being knit together by China. So that security architecture continues. The economic one is much more uncertain, and that's the bizarre thing. Like, the U.S. is not going back to the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. But we could get in a world, if we play this badly, where on the defense and security side, we're more and more integrated. But if our tariff war gets bad, we could end up in a place where Australia, which is slow-rolling China on CPTPP, decides they're going to separate defense and economics and let China into CPTPP. I mean, Korea, Japan, Australia, Europe, they're all looking for leverage vis-a-vis an administration that could put tariffs on the levels we haven't seen since 1930. And so they're looking for leverage with China on the trade side. So you could have a very bifurcated architecture with more integration on defense, but competition on the economic side. I think we'll avoid that because the American people don't like high prices, and tariffs cause high prices. So I think the politics of this and the market reaction will mean we avoid that rupture on economic architecture. And then the question is, what is the economic architecture we build? There are very good ideas in the Trump administration and Congress about coalitions, agreements, frameworks around critical minerals, obviously semiconductors and AI, LNG and energy. These are not, WTO trade liberalization deals we used to know, but they're national security driven supply chain agreements. But we're not going to be able to do that if we're fighting a trade war. So you and I are meeting at a time when this is all up in the air. Yeah. And we'll see where it goes. I think it will do so much damage to ourselves with this that we'll get out of it and then we'll have to rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, like you get this in terms of the counter leverage, you get this initial signaling as we saw with, China, Japan, and Korea meeting for the first time in 4 years over the trilateral FTA. No one knows whether that's going to actually go anywhere because it's been under negotiation for a long time, but there's clearly some signaling and posturing going on there. I mean, in a sense, it may even require the allies and partners really to be the ones to try to correct by using things like new energy deals or shipbuilding deals or other things to sort of get themselves exempt from this wave of tariff that's coming to try to keep it from becoming this sort of it would be a very bizarre and bifurcated situation if you had like adversarial relations on trade, but then strong relations on security.
I just don't think it's possible we're in that world well, I think it's likely we'll be in that world in the short term. Yeah. It's just hard for me to picture how that lasts for the long term because it's so damaging to the American consumer and investor. The other thing to keep in mind is, you know, as I tell our students, trade is dating, but foreign direct investment is marriage. Right. And the FDI flows with Japan, Korea, Australia, Taiwan are overwhelmingly up. And their investments in China are flagging. You know, they're diversifying. And that will help to weather the trade fight and give us a little bit of a better chance to get through this. But we'll see. The Trump administration is capable of having 4 mutually exclusive thoughts at the same time. Yeah. You know, allies are important, but we're also going to slap huge tariffs on them. And it doesn't seem sustainable to me politically, but we'll see.
Yeah, we shall see. So anyway, Mike, it's great to have you on the Impossible State podcast. Great to have you here back at CSIS. To our viewers, thanks again for watching this episode of the Impossible State. If you haven't, please go back and watch our Friday podcast, which was our live coverage of the Constitutional Court decision on President Yoon's impeachment case and the commentary we had during that podcast. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Impossible State. Judgment Day in Korea. The Constitutional Court rules on the impeachment of President Yoon. Next up on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show,
Trump 2.0 and Korea, next on the impossible state.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome everyone to the Impossible State, first episode of Impossible State in 2025. My name is Ellen Kim, Senior Fellow of the CSI's Korea Chair and host of the show today, sitting in for Dr. Victor Cha. Today we're going to discuss North Korea under the second Trump administration. I'm very glad to sit down with Sydney Seiler, who is no stranger to the show. Sydney Seiler is a well-known top expert on Korea. He has worked for the U.S. government and held numerous positions, including National Security Council at White House, National Intelligence Council, Office of Director of National Intelligence and Central Intelligence Agency, and National Security Agency. Currently, he's a senior advisor with the Korea Chair at CSIS. Welcome back to the show, Sid.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to today.
So with the President Donald Trump's inauguration held yesterday, there are a lot of things we can discuss today. But I want to start with you about President Donald Trump's remark from yesterday. He called North Korea a nuclear power. And his Defense Secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, also called North Korea as a nuclear power in his written response to the Senate hearings a few weeks ago. So it's quite it doesn't seem coincidental that both the Commander-in-Chief and Defense Secretary nominee say the same thing. So what do you make of it? What does it tell us?
Well, I think it tells us that, President Trump and his national security team have looked at the North Korea threat, what has evolved over the last 4 years while he was out of office, and, face the reality that North Korea continues to grow its arsenal qualitatively and quantitatively. The threat that we face today is greater than the threat was 4 years ago. So it's a degree of just simply a realistic view of the threat. At the same time, I don't know that it means very much or gives too much insight into how the administration will deal with North Korea. I know the president has hinted that he believes Kim Jong-un would be happy that he's back in office, that he's prepared to engage in dialogue with adversaries around the world, and North Korea would be one of them. That leaves open the possibility for talks. Unfortunately, the road forward is in large part right now in Kim Jong-un's hands. He has refused to talk to the United States really since 2019, his failure to lock in his nuclear status at Hanoi, subsequent meeting with the president in Panmunjom later that year, and of course the working level meeting at Stockholm, which was the last contact. Since then, Kim Jong-un has been adamant in refusing to talk to the United States. So it's hard to predict at this time how that might change.
So, as just following up on what you just said, many people actually expect that summit diplomacy might resume under the second Trump administration. And however, as you just said, if you recall, in late December, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said that he would adopt the toughest anti-U.S. counteractions. Do you think, is that just a rhetoric or is it something else?
So that's a great question. Again, to kind of do a little bit of review, right? After the Hanoi failure and the lack of any progress during the remainder of the Trump administration, North Korea kind of laid out a framework in a major party meeting towards the end of 2019, proclaimed on January 1st, 2020, that basically said we are no longer interested in talking to the outside. We don't need sanctions relief. Through perseverance, through endurance, through austerity, we will overcome this isolation and we will prevail as a nuclear power. And in subsequent amplifying language up to and including the declaration at the beginning of last year that no longer would North Korea seek any dialogue with the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Kim Jong-un has laid the ideological foundation for talking neither to the United States or the Republic of Korea. That said, Donald Trump's return to office provides an opportunity for Kim to review that position. And certainly the current domestic political developments in South Korea probably have led Kim Jong-un to reconsider perhaps, his reluctance to talk with South Korea. So going forward, I think we should assume continuity, at least for maybe the first half year, 12 months. If you watched the inauguration yesterday, President Trump has a pretty ambitious agenda with a lot of issues, domestic and foreign. And I just don't know that, with Kim Jong-un refusing to come to the table, how much effort President Trump could invest in North Korea and expect any type of meaningful return.
So, so it seems like he will probably, given a lot of things that President Trump would like to do domestically, I guess that his foreign international agenda would be probably, maybe Ukraine war, and then Gaza, Israel, and then probably North Korea next, probably, right? Is that correct?
Well, possibly, although, for the president, obviously China is a high priority.
Yes.
Both in terms of its economic challenges as well as the growing threat that China poses throughout the Indo-Pacific to the global order itself. And so the good news is, even if we put North Korea below Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, and China, North Korea is directly involved, as you know, in the Ukraine issue and Russia's aggression there. So the issue of North Korea troops supporting the war effort will doubtlessly be part of the president's efforts to try to find a resolution to that conflict. And certainly you can't talk too much about conflict in China, potential cross-straits tension there over Taiwan without North Korea coming up in that conversation. So this issue is even if it looks like, because Kim Jong-un isn't talking and there's no dialogue underway, it looks like nothing's going on. Indeed, a lot is being done on the North Korea issue.
Let's turn our focus to South Korea a little bit. You already mentioned a little bit about that. Given the political vacuum in South Korea right now, how do you think this will impact North Korea's provocation behavior? So far, North Korea has launched one intermediate range ballistic missile and several short range ballistic missiles right before the inauguration day. But do you think that North Korea will likely ramp up the provocation just like it did in 2017? Or are we on a sort of a different path considering the existing tie between Kim and President Trump, and also very different security environment in various countries?
So, yeah, I'd like to personally myself separate provocations that are lethal and kinetic in nature, like the sinking of the Cheonan back in 2010, the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do, and other similar types of provocations that actually involve some type of escalation of tension, firing back and forth, and occasionally, unfortunately, sacrifices, human life sacrificed along the way, as opposed to missile launches, which are part of a research and development and deployment and employment strategy. We will see missiles launched for development purposes. We will see missiles launched as part of training. We may see a seventh nuclear test. It sends a stronger signal. And while all those are described as provocations, they're all asserted by North Korea as their legitimate right to launch and test missiles like everybody else does. So the question is, I think, the more important one is, will Kim follow through on his threats made early in last year, in 2024, that said they would re-examine the boundaries and enforce what should be the righteous boundaries, and with a reference to the northern limit line, that line on the west coast that serves to kind of separate the forces out there, a line that was drawn by the UN command and the Republic of Korea, not recognized rhetorically by North Korea, but in generally abided by. And if they were to try to reestablish some type of maritime boundary and use force to enforce it, it would put South Korea in the position of having to either accept the newly Pyongyang-defined boundary and essentially admit diplomatic defeat, or use force to try to restore the northern limit line. And that might drive up tensions. That might, at a time of political uncertainty in South Korea and uncertainty that somewhat goes into the U.S.-ROK alliance, it would be an ideal type of lethal kinetic provocation for North Korea to engage in, to try to sow more dissent and debate in South Korea about North Korea policy. So that is definitely something I think I'd be looking at in the future weeks and months, as North Korea seeks to maybe exploit the current domestic political difficulties that Seoul is encountering right now.
There is a concern in South Korea that South Korea might be isolated once the some sort of dialogue starts happening between the U.S. and North Korea. And I think that yesterday, what do you think about that?
So we settled on this term Korea passing. We used to use Tongmi Bongnam all the time, right? Talking to the U.S. while sealing off South Korea. And, part of the problem is, even when you have the best intentions between Washington and Seoul, there's not going to be what I would call absolute simultaneous transparency in what is going on, but that indeed, both sides need to be committed to ensuring that this Korea passing doesn't take place. I personally was involved both in the secret diplomacy that we engaged in early 2011, and then later on the open diplomacy that led to the Leap Day understanding. And if you recall, back in 2011, we were still recovering from the Cheonan sinking and the Yeonpyeong-do shelling. The U.S. was very sensitive to ROK political needs at that time, but we were also committed to moving forward with diplomacy. And before we would meet with the North Koreans, we'd sit down and share what was going on. And afterwards, we would debrief. And indeed, there was no real Korea passing, but there was always that impression of that. And part of that is more a frustration out of Seoul's inability to get Pyongyang really interested in their Korean dialogue. The fact that at the end of the day, North Korea just doesn't want a better relationship with South Korea. And sometimes when they do, it's only to get to the United States. So there's a frustration over that. But I don't think that that equates to the same as the U.S. ignoring South Korea's interest as it pursues North Korea. And I think that would be the same if there is progress on the U.S. DPRK front during the Trump administration. I think the Trump team will see value in keeping South Korea as a partner.
Yeah, sure. So if summit does take place down the road, what do you think Kim Jong-un might demand this time? And what's your opinion on the potential small deal that some people are speculating?
That's a great question. And the challenge I think that we face is, a misunderstanding of what transpired in Hanoi in terms of, whether North Korea came to the table with Kim Jong-un came to the table with an intent to negotiate fairly and sincerely, or whether we were going to get the same deal that, we have had for the past several years, limited facilities at Yongbyon in exchange for sanctions relief. The president rightly walked away from that, but while walking away from that at Hanoi, instructed, his team to continue to follow up. And indeed, it wasn't so much that Hanoi failed, but that North Korea over the subsequent months and now years has demonstrated it's not even interested in a small deal with the United States. But I would imagine that North Korea would be looking for, like in any negotiation, a minimalist approach, putting as little on the table to get as many benefits as possible. That's not surprising. That's what everybody does in a negotiation. But it would be about sanctions relief, would be about alleviating pressure. And what they would probably put on the table is perhaps some limited symbolic moratoria, for example, on long-range missile launches or nuclear testing. And I think that deal will be as unappealing today as it was 5-6 years ago. And so this will be the real challenge. Not only that, from North Korea's perspective, in their relationship with Russia, they have secured a way around sanctions. They have secured by sending 10,000 plus troops to help Russia in their conflict with Ukraine, the ban on workers. And so there's the possibility for additional soldiers to be sent or workers to be sent to help in the reconstruction or in other Far East, Russia Far East projects. That possibility is there. So North Korea, the urgency of sanctions relief is not so great now because of the development of relations with Russia. The security guarantees that, they otherwise might seek from the United States, they've got a strategic partnership with Russia. So there's much less incentive today for Kim Jong-un to put any part of his program on the table. Given his improving relations with Russia and the things that he is able to secure from Vladimir Putin, that I'm certain, Donald Trump would not be, eagerly looking to put on the table.
I see. I want to hear your thoughts on China, specifically Beijing's priority concerning the Korean Peninsula right now. Former U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said, quote, Putin might be close to reversing a decade-long policy by Russia and accepting DPRK's nuclear weapons program. With that statement and Trump's remark yesterday, have you noticed any indication that China's core interests on the peninsula have changed or might change given the evolving security environment in general?
Yeah, I think their core interests remain a quiet Korean peninsula where there's no conflict or uncertainty or tension that would otherwise lead to an increased demand signal for U.S. military presence in the region. I think China, for the past 7 decades, ever since, frankly, Kim Il-sung made the decision to invade in 1950, has had to deal with a North Korea that is unpredictable, that at times will lash out, and over which, at the end of the day, its leverage has been limited. At least the levers that China is willing to pull are small in numbers. We always talk about they could cut off food, they could cut off fuel, but they've never been willing to risk the destabilizing effects that those types of actions would have. And so their actual ability to execute leverage over North Korea has been limited throughout the Cold War. And so now we're in this newly emerging order, this post-Cold War order, and many of the dynamics remain the same. I think China right now has been a bit back-footed and surprised by Russia's approach to North Korea, which has kind of put Beijing a distant second in Kim Jong-un's attention. And it's also helping to embolden Kim. If Russia gives it technologies to improve its WMD program and conventional program, Kim Jong-un's options to engage in military actions targeting South Korea, even short of an all-out war for unification, increase. And this destabilizes the peninsula. I think these are types of conversations that Xi Jinping has been having with Vladimir Putin. It explains why we have this stand down, essentially, of PRC, DPRK diplomacy. And again, these things they shift tactically. If you look back over the decades, there are periods where the relationship grows close, and then when it grows distance. Right now, there's some distance in that relationship. I think all eyes have to be focused on the Trump team's engagement of China, because I think this will be one of the issues that will be on a long list of topics that will be discussed. Even I think I read speculation on President Trump making a trip to China to have a summit with Xi Jinping. So North Korea is going to be on the top of that, and so. That should give more insight into how China sees the North Korea issue right now, how it sees the Trump team's intent to handle that issue. 2017 was a highlight of our cooperation with China on North Korea. And the major driver of that, of course, was not anything either Donald Trump was doing or his predecessor Barack Obama or what Xi Jinping was doing. It was what Pyongyang was doing, right? And so when tensions increase on the peninsula, China is more inclined to cooperate. When they're manageable, there's no it's not in China's interest to work with the United States on North Korea. And that's why this issue has, over the years, gotten so bad, is because it's been largely, handled by Beijing in this way. So I think all eyes need to be on the nature of the China-U.S. relationship under Donald Trump to see what type of working kind of relationship he is able to build with Xi Jinping. And that might give maybe some hope for a new approaches on North Korea that haven't been tried in the past.
That's very interesting. If somehow U.S.-China relations, intensifies, that could provide an opening for North Korea to draw China closer as well. But at the same time, China has this growing relationship with Russia. And I think that one thing I'm very curious about is how China sees this ongoing military, transfer, advanced technology transfer from Russia to North Korea. Do you think that Putin and Xi has some sort of conversation about that? Or is it something that Russia is unwilling to cooperate with China on that front, even though there is an industrial defense? China is providing a defense industry support to Russia for its war in Ukraine.
Right. I mean, we think back to 2022, before Russia's military actions against Ukraine, there was talk about this growing axis of upheaval, axis of authoritarianism, these challenges to the international order, largely driven by Moscow and Beijing, and we saw partners, and we always included Iran and North Korea in that list. In his Foreign Affairs article, former Secretary of State Blinken made it clear that, well, we're troubled by these revisionist countries and their cooperation. He was hesitant to use the word axis because it wasn't so clear that there was a a body or that these countries acted multilaterally per se. We see a lot of cooperation between these revisionist states bilaterally, but the idea that now there was going to be some more institutionalized formal order challenging the U.S.-led liberal order wasn't so certain. It remains uncertain, and I think it more concretely translates into the question, will Russia's cooperation with North Korea continue after some type of hostilities and some type of halt to hostilities has been achieved in Ukraine? Or does Russia still have these ambitions for being the leader of this new order that's challenging, the United States? I believe Xi Jinping's desire to achieve that type of leading role in the international community remains. He may have been a bit disturbed, quite frankly, at Putin's actions in a way that kind of stigmatized this new alternative order in ways that probably Xi Jinping did not want to do at that point in time. But Vladimir Putin moved. Xi had to adjust to accept it, and North Korea embraced it. So there's a lot of uncertainty now as we have a new president in the United States. There's talk about resolving the Ukraine crisis. There's talk about the president engaging China. So all those dynamics may shift, and it's still too early, 24 hours into the new Trump team, to fully assess how that might break. I think that will be one area that a lot of people, not only North Korea experts, but people looking at this new geostrategic order will be discussing in the days and weeks ahead.
So let's move on to Ukraine war. There have been a lot of reports coming out about the North Korean soldiers participating in the war, and I would like to hear your assessment about them. What have you observed so far and about them, and what would be the implication of this North Korean troop deployment for Korea in the future?
Yeah, this is an area where it really takes a lot of caution because there's so much disinformation out there, and there's so many motives behind a lot of the reporting. It's really hard to sift out the nuggets of truth and then try to ignore the speculative information. What do we know? That troops were sent in. The numbers, I think there's an agreement on 10 to 12,000. Rumors it may be upwards of 100,000. The question of whether Putin asked for them first or Kim Jong-un offered them first, I think that's an important question because it gets to the motive. And I'm inclined to believe that this might be something that the Kim Jong-un teed up for Putin. But I wouldn't be surprised either way. It's not that important, but it does show. It may indicate what Kim was seeking to achieve through this, and then also because of that, then you can scope how big this might grow going forward. If the goal was to demonstrate North Korea's willingness to shed blood for an ideological political partner, then that's accomplished with already, frankly. And we know the casualty numbers. They range, they vary. The idea that within a couple of months, all 10,000 or so would be dead is not surprising given what we know about the casualty rates the Russians have been encountering. That these would still be within a manageable number for Kim to manage at home. I know there's speculation that, once the families learn where they're going and what they're dying for, this is going to be a problem for Kim Jong-un. I don't know. This is a guy who's got some incredible propaganda agitation apparatus behind him and who can sell the value to North Korea of helping a fraternal brother in need. So the troops are there. They're not making a difference. Not many people thought they would. For the type of actions, every military action needs people pushing buttons to launch missiles, people standing guard to be on the lookout for an enemy. Not very sophisticated task, I think, that they were assigned to. So, the question of how much will this improve the Korean People's Army's readiness now that they have war experience, I think there'll be some. I think it's important not to overemphasize that. But going forward, I think the symbolism now has been achieved, and we should see whether, well, first of all, how the negotiations between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump go, and to try to bring an end to these hostilities, and what piece the North Korea participation has in that, whether part of that is getting the North out of there, and whether Putin is ready to essentially throw North Korea under the bus, use them and lose them. These are areas that are uncertain going forward, but they're there, they're fighting, they're not making much of a difference, and it's a sad tragedy both for the Ukrainians that are dying in the process, as well as the North Koreans called to go to a land they know nothing about, language they cannot speak, and dying for a cause that isn't theirs.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on that. But speaking of, Kim Jong-un might have teed up this troop deployment to Putin. When you think about it, even though these are trained soldiers who are loyal to the regime, Kim Jong-un might have thought, essentially these soldiers are exposure to the outside world. And I was wondering whether that would be considered as a risk for Kim Jong-un to take. What do you think about that?
It's kind of interesting. It's somewhat related to the idea of Russian tourists coming into North Korea. Because if you look at COVID and the post-COVID environment, in particular, Kim's concerns that expectations for improved U.S.-DPRK relations before Hanoi were dangerous or threatening to the regime at a certain level, and certainly that South Korean culture and any improvement of relations with South Korea would also be a potential risk to the regime. We've seen over the past few years a recalibration of how much liberalization is tolerable. Liberalization, including everything from, having cell phones to having market activity, being able to use foreign currency, all those things that over the years were either a relief mechanism to the economic hardships the North had, or were just simply the natural evolution of IT technologies providing exposure to South Korean culture, for example. And so we can see that Kim has been worried about this. This is perceived as a threat to the Kim family rule going forward. Similarly, there's a degree of risk when you send soldiers over to Russia. I think Russia isn't South Korea. There's no R-pop or R-dramas to go watch, and there's no other, I think, attractiveness to, to these soldiers that they would go over there and see something that would kind of undermine their view of their home country or what have you. So I think it was seen as by Kim as manageable. And so, the experience of war, the experience of going overseas, working with the Russians, did not appear to be that unmanageable a risk for Kim when he made the decision.
I see. So I have a final question. Since you remember the publication of the ODNI's National Intelligence Estimate in 2023, you actually had our event here at CSIS. Do you think that anything has changed since then regarding North Korea's intentions? I ask this because this current environment has dramatically changed. North Korea is getting support from Russia, that could have emboldened North Korean leader to take more assertive and aggressive actions. And a year ago, Kim Jong-un actually renounced the country's decade-long policy of unification with South Korea and calling South Korea the enemy. So some people might wonder if that would be some kind of indication of North Korea's revisionist ambitions.
Those are very legitimate concerns, and if you look at the National Intelligence Estimate in what we released, in addition to the key judgments on whether North Korea would primarily use nuclear weapons for defensive purposes, coercive or offensive purposes, is a chart that looks at the drivers.
It was very helpful.
Yeah, and those drivers, I mean, they're striking today in terms of what they said about, Kim's growing confidence in his, first of all, that coercive or revisionist actions yield political benefits. This has been, it's been both the provocation calculus and the focus of U.S. Policy for many years. I remember early on in the Obama administration, one of the key objectives of the Obama team's policy was to de-incentivize provocations, to not reward North Korea for bad behavior. The idea that there's a confidence that such behavior might pay off and that China and Russia would have its back, both in terms of either being willing to provide cover to any overzealous South Korean response to North Korea actions, or simply being there as a lifeline of support, so that coercive or revisionist behavior did not result in additional pressures and sanctions. And indeed, it would only encourage Beijing and Moscow to urge the international community to take a softer approach, to listen to North Korea's legitimate security concerns, to relieve and alleviate the pressure and sanctions, et cetera. And so I think now, if Kim's looked at China's and Russia's sanctions enforcement since 2017, he needs to be encouraged that at the end of the day, neither Russia or China would act as obstacles to him carrying out those types of actions. And then finally, Kim's confidence in his conventional forces. Deterrence theorists talk about this stability instability paradox, that as two countries kind of match each other in the nuclear domain, it provides one of the actors to be more adventuresome and be more risk-taking in the conventional realm. And this seems to be really a good model through which to look at North Korea, that now that it has these nuclear capabilities to deter over-the-top retaliations from South Korea or the United States, that it would feel more comfortable operating in the conventional realm. And perhaps the reason we haven't seen this until now not is so much because North Korea has been contained, but because Kim's conventional forces have been in a protracted period of neglect since really the Cold War, undertrained, underfed, underfueled, a million-man force where quantity has a quality all of its own, as we used to like to say. But now with assistance from Russia that we've been hearing discussed as the quid for the support that North Korea has been providing to Vladimir Putin, with these improvements across air defense systems, Navy, and even in ground, we would see a more credible conventional force, and then suddenly the options available to Kim Jong-un, expand. The motivation remains the same, to either galvanize loyalty and support for the regime at home, distract attention from internal hardships, inflict political punishment and embarrassment on the South Korean government and for its North Korea policy, drive a wedge in the U.S.-ROK relationship, and ultimately, establish more firmly a dominant position on the peninsula where Pyongyang's needs and demands take priority over those of South Korea. A gradual process that they could move down this path from the mere coercive into the revisionist. So I think those concerns still need to be there, and a discussion needs to be had on how to deter them.
Yeah.
In particular, where we now have a situation in South Korea where the greatest accomplishments, I think, of during the last 4 years in deterring North Korea, the Washington Declaration, the Nuclear Consultative Group, Camp David, and what powerful message is sent to both China and North Korea through trilateral cooperation, our strategic asset deployments, our demonstrations to the people of the Republic of Korea of our commitment to their defense. there's now a debate on whether those actually led to destabilization and antagonized excessively North Korea, China, and Russia. So these are, questions going forward. What works, what doesn't, what causes tensions needlessly, what projects hopes for engagement without any justification. These are the types, I think, as we look at North Korea policy, particularly not only under the new Trump administration, but out of what South Korea leadership for the coming years. These are the types of conversations we need to continue to have.
And we're sure we're going to watch this over the coming years.
Right.
Yeah. So excellent. This is a very timely and I think insightful discussion. Thank you so much, Sid, for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Ellen.
To our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in. Today's Impossible State. We look forward to seeing you again in the future episode. See you soon.